The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. San Francisco Giants baseball, past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tyko, and the host is Michael Duca.
Hey, Ralph.
Michael? Back from your trip, 85%, getting over the flu, and had one of those, you described it, self-described, bucket list moments since you've been gone. So I'm happy, delighted that you're almost recovered completely. You went back. Tell us about your trip and what the bucket list was.
Well, we took a little over a week to go back to Washington, D.C., and stayed at an Airbnb with some absolutely delightful people, very close to the National Zoo, and became quite skilled at the intricacies of the Washington metro system. We spent as much time underground as we could. While we weren't underground, we were inside buildings because the weather was a little bit torturous while we were back there. We had one day where Washington set a record high temperature for the date and a record low temperature for the same date, when the thermometer stretched from 70 to -2.
Whoa! In the same day?
Not only that, Ralph.
The next day.
It was 62 degrees at midnight and 17 at 3 a.m. That's the effect of a cold front passing through.
Whoa. And how do you dress? I mean, you just dress in layers? Is that the idea?
You wear everything you own, and you spend most of the week cussing yourself out at a high volume for having left your gloves and watch cap sitting on the dressing chair in the bedroom when you left the house instead of putting them on.
Oh, yes.
And when I say in the house, I mean back here in the Bay Area.
Right.
One thing I can tell you, when you arrive in Washington, D.C., and the wind chill is -2, there's no gloves and hats for sale. They're all gone. We tried everything, everywhere. They were all gone.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm sorry you went through it without your gear, so to speak. Reminds me of the candlestick days when the Giants would wear these parkas. It was incredibly windy and cold, as you well remember.
And damp. That
Right.
was the worst part. It wasn't so much the cold as the fact that when you have fog being blown at you at 40 miles an hour, I don't care what the temperature is, that's going to cut through everything you're wearing and go right straight to your bones.
Right, and the Giants themselves compensated by literally having Alaska-like parkas that would go.
Yeah, they were anoraks. You're right.
Yeah, and that was a terrific advantage. Giants used the parkas, the stick as an advantage. A lot of them loved playing there, as crazy as it was. If they didn't love it,
there was a watershed in that. I don't know if you remember, Ralph, but when Al Rosen came to the Giants from the Astros, one of the first things he did, he sat down with his team. He showed up, I think it was in September of 1986. He sat down with the entire team in September, and he said, I don't ever want to hear a complaint about the weather in this place again. Not one, not ever. It's an advantage. Use it as an advantage. The visiting team hates it as much as you do, and they're not prepared for it. Use it.
Right. And he built that team very quickly with Hum Baby, Roger Craig,
and
the terrific fortune of having not only Will Clark but Robbie Thompson arrive very quickly. I don't think either of them played a day in AAA. I think they both came up out of AA, and well, it made all the difference. Quickly,
They both made the jump. They made it together in the same spring, and it was the spring of '87, wasn't it?
I think it might have been '86, and I think Rosen might have taken over in '85, but
Okay. I know he took over during the 100 loss season.
Right.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
Because I remember that the first day he was on the job. Yes. And the first day that Al was on the job, I went to the game. Miserable game in September, with I don't even remember the opponent, but I remember thinking that the two teams were about 50 games out of first combined. And there was a letter on Giants letterhead, not photocopied onto white paper, but on Giants letterhead, there was a letter from Al Rosen being handed out at the gates to everyone who came in, talking about how we weren't going to use this ballpark and its environs as an excuse anymore, talking about how the goal was to not lose 100, not become the first Giants franchise to lose 100 games, saying that there really was something to play for in September. We appreciate your support, and this will turn around quickly. And boy, was he right. The only thing they missed out on was that they did become the only team in franchise history to lose exactly 100 games.
Right, that very year.
And they were the last Major League franchise to do so. Every other franchise had lost 100 games in the course of a season.
Whoa. Did not realize that. I certainly knew that the Mets did that pretty quickly in their existence.
Mets did that in their first year by mid-August.
Right. And sadly, for a Met fan like myself, the second year was worse. It had all the losses, all the heartbreak, without any of that silly humor of Marv Throneberry, and they scored 16 runs. Well, did they win? That kind of thing. I was a kid, and I grew up in New York, and we had the Giants, Dodgers, and Yankees, and every year there was a World Series. And when the Giants left, I had 5 years of floundering as a fan. I was always a Giants apologist, but always angry at the franchise. To this day, it could have been different. But my point being, the Mets come in, and everybody loves the idea they're losing and what have you, and I just didn't find it all that amusing. I thought it was tough. Second year was tougher. And the same humbaby was the starting pitcher who lost 20 games as a Met, Roger Craig. And
that is absolutely correct.
Yeah. So there's definitely a connect, and I can remember when the Giants came back to New York for those first few times, how once was an exhibition game, if I'm not mistaken, with the Yankees, what they called the Mayor's Trophy game or some such stuff. And Mays, I can remember Mays getting this ovation that was bone-chilling. New York lost Willie in his prime, and you guys got him out here. Ironically, I lived most of my life out here, not by design, but I was stationed out here in the Air Force and stayed, so I did get to see Willie for most of his career. And it always comes back to that as a Giant fan. When you say Willie, you go, whoa. That's in our ramblings, it always comes back to Willie, doesn't it?
Well, what's interesting is that there was a time, it didn't last very long, but there was a time when the Giants had 3 pretty good Willies in the lineup.
Kirkland?
They had Mays, they had McCovey, and they had Kirkland.
Yes.
And as opposing pitchers would say, that stretch of lineup would give any pitcher the Willies.
The Willies, yes. Do you remember that little bit about when the Dodgers had this bit going? The differences in Willie's can be seen in Davis's can be seen in many ways. And it was something like Willie does this, Willie does, and Tommy does that. And the San Francisco writers made up a little ditty of their own. They said that differences in Davis's can be seen in many ways. Willie is not Tommy, and Tommy is not Mays.
And that's absolutely true. And whose hero was Tommy Davis? There's a player who followed him whose hero he was.
Well,
the number is a clue.
I know he was from Brooklyn.
The number is a clue. What number did Tommy Davis wear?
Was it Dusty Baker?
Yes.
Who followed him? Because Dusty was 12 as well.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, to this day, Dusty will tell you that Tommy was his hero and that Junior Gilliam was his mentor.
Whoa.
Along with Hank, of course.
Yes. I think he wasn't on deck. Roland Office was on deck. Roland from Sacramento.
Also from Sacramento.
Yes, also. Well, I had this discussion with Lenny Randall, who's from Southern California, and who claims Dusty? Does Riverside claim Dusty, or does Sacramento claim Dusty?
Well, Dusty went to high school in Sacramento. Right. Dusty ran at the state track meet, which I covered in 1967 for Rancho Cordova High School. And Riverside gets all the Bonzes, all of them.
Right. And
Bobby and Robert and Barry.
It was Bobby Jr. to go along
Roberta.
With it, who very skilled. Had Bobby Jr. not gotten into martial arts or something in his early years, he would have made a big impression. I can't say he would have been as good as his brother or certainly his dad or whatever, but he was very talented.
Well, I'll tell you who could say that. Barry. Barry said throughout his entire career, if my brother had not gotten diverted with drugs and other issues, he would have been twice as good as me. He had all the skills that I never had. He had the arm, he had the cat-like reflexes, and just as much speed. I mean, the whole family was blessed with speed because, they came from a family of sprinters, of Olympic sprinters. Through his entire career, Barry would tell anybody who would listen that, he was as good as he was primarily, and people didn't want to believe this, but it was actually true, primarily because of hard work. You don't think of it when you see Barry Bonds, but Barry Bonds was kind of the reincarnation of Pete Rose. He was a guy with above-average skills and superhuman power, but above-average skills whose work ethic allowed him to develop into a premium player, just like Rose. And, he said Bobby Jr. was blessed with all of the talent and all of the skills and just chose to do something else.
Yeah. He did play some pro ball. I got to meet him in, was either Fresno or an A team with the Giants. I was doing my Tops gig as the Tops representative, and I got to meet him down there, and he took some making friends with. He had the Barry Bonds kind of chip on his shoulder, but once you got to know him, he wasn't that. He's a very warm guy. I hope he's doing okay now. I haven't been been in contact with him for a lot of years, but I hope life's good to him.
I agree with you. And all of the men in the Bonds family were deeply, deeply influenced in their attitudes and personalities by Mama Pat. Pat Bonds is without question the toughest woman I've ever met in my life.
Really?
And I'm sure she felt she had to be that way to protect her brood. She knew that, her husband was famous and in the limelight, and her kids were like that. I mean, shoot, Ralph, people were coming to see Barry play high school ball at Sarah as a freshman. And they played in San Mateo. A local writer here by the name of Rick Eimer remembers covering a game when Barry was a freshman. Rick also went to Sarah, and he remembers Barry hitting a ball not just out of the ball field, but out of the city park and across the street off the top of a van.
Whoa.
And if you've been to that park in San Mateo, you know that's a 500-foot shot. And this is a high school freshman doing this.
And he wasn't big. He was able to turn on the ball. That rotation of the hips is where and the wrists are where these guys got their power from. Aaron wasn't very big. So this whole steroidal thing with home runs, it's kind of weird in a way. If you, I think of guys like Ernie Banks, just the toy cannon, Wynn, for instance. Morgan had a lot of power. Little guys weren't always slap hitters.
Dick Allen wasn't a big guy.
Yeah, Willie was. He under 6 feet. Not that
5'10". Willie's 5'10", and he played at 185 pounds.
Right, but it was a tight 185 pounds. It was. He was.
Well, you're talking about an Alabama all-state quarterback, all-state point guard. And those were the sports he didn't pursue. He turned down a scholarship to LSU to play baseball or football, which was interestingly enough, considering everything in the future, that scholarship was offered to him as much as anything else because of an former LSU quarterback alumnus by the name of Alvin Dark.
Yeah, he wasn't. I don't think he was a quarterback. I think he was a running back. But maybe
Dark. I don't. Yeah, that it
but
clearly
he beat
predated
out. I don't
me
remember
and
LSU All-American back then that Dark beat out for the starting half. A great football player. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. Dark was another one, two-sport athlete. Probably more. Mm-hmm. He was a golfer as well. Dark was a terrific athlete.
Well, now we're talking about the difference between the 20th century and the 21st century. In the 20th century, if you were an athlete, you played every sport. You may not have been great at every sport, but you played every sport. If you were in high school in the 1950s and you were an athlete, you did football and you did basketball and you did baseball and you might have tried to squeeze in track. But now, kids are specializing at the age of 9. They do nothing but play baseball all year round.
There's no room for other sports. Whatever sport you pick is 360, 24/7.
Well, and that's the fault of parents who, for whatever reason, see their kids as either a meal ticket or they see their kids as that unique and special talent that's going to be game-changing when they get to be 21 years old, and they therefore have to do, the LeVar Ball thing. It's wrong. It's bad for the kids. It's bad for the sports. And there's not one major league level baseball player who will tell you should make your kids concentrate on baseball. They will all tell you you need to develop all of your body. You need fast twitch muscles to play baseball. You need to develop your legs with spring to play basketball and to have stamina, which helps you with fast twitch stamina in baseball. You need to develop your overall upper body strength, which is what you're going to do with football. So, the guys who are playing at the major league level today will tell you play everything, play lots of sports, give your body time off, give your shoulder time off while it's knitting while you're 15 and 16 and 17 and 18. Don't go out there and throw 240 innings a year.
Okay. I don't want to forget to do this, Michael. I want you to talk about what I think is your lifelong accomplishment. You went to the Library of Congress with your book.
I went to the Library of Congress. Like any other American is able to do, I got a library card. You have to apply for it. You can actually apply for it online or at your home library, but I was able to do it there in D.C. and get a card issued in just a few moments. And then you're allowed into the reading room. And the reading room is the giant central rotunda that everybody knows from the Nicolas Cage movie National Treasure. But it's not allowed to take photographs in that room, which I did not realize until I got there. But I put in an order, and they brought my book from across the street in the James Madison building. The main building that everybody thinks of as the library is the Jefferson building. And there it was, no dust covers, stamped Library of Congress across the top in ink. And to be able to hold a book that you were a part of and to do so in the Library of Congress is clearly a moment. And it's a moment that the librarian has obviously seen thousands of times, because the first thing she said was, "I'll take your picture. You can't, but I can."
Oh, wow. Wow. Nice. And how did they get you the picture? Did they email you it or?
Oh, they used my phone.
Oh, okay. But that's the rule, that you can't, but they could. So
right. And then she also said, and you're not allowed to take pictures in here, but if you go back in the alcoves, nobody can see what you're doing. There's no video back there, and it's clearly a rule that's observed more in the breach than in the practice.
Right, and I'm sure that when it was first put in and there were no pictures, there were a lot of disappointed authors. So I'm sure
it's true. I mean, the reason for it is pretty simple and straightforward. They do not want you photographing copyrighted material and taking it out. Pretty much the same reason that you have to check everything you're carrying and run your laptop and your phone and things like that through an X-ray machine, and take yourself through an X-ray machine and a magnetometer on your way out. They're much more interested or much more concerned about what you're taking out with you than what you're taking in.
You know that I would venture to say the Homeland Security plays a big part in that now with the X-rays and what have you, because I went back to New York a year or so ago, and to go to the Empire State Building, they had me put a nail clipper that I had in my bag in a little envelope thing, and I couldn't get it back until I left. A nail clipper.
Right.
So the mood of the country, and I would think if I were out to making a bad impression as a terrorist or something like that. Wow, the Library of Congress would, anything happens to that, you'd have mourners from coast to coast. So,
well, and one of the things that you learn when you're there, Ralph, is that the Library of Congress burned. The original Library of Congress was Thomas Jefferson's library, which is why the main building is the Jefferson Building. He willed his entire library to the nation. And it was one of the larger private libraries at the time. But a number of the books from that were lost in a fire in the early, in the late 1800s. The building that we currently call the Library of Congress was not constructed until, well, it was finished in 1897. They started building it in the late 1880s, and it's one of the last examples of really beautiful, ornate, neoclassical design. I mean, inside that building are some of the most beautiful ceilings in America. When you think of going to Washington, D.C., most people don't think of going to the Library of Congress. They say, oh, well, that's the Capitol behind me, and wow, there's the Supreme Court, and there's another building, with no label on the front. And
what have you.
The
Smithsonian is quite a kick in the ass, I must say, when you go to
the Smithsonian is the entire National Mall now. I mean, and then some. There's the Museum of the Native American. There's the African American Museum, which we saw, and which is among the most moving things I've ever seen in my life.
Does Jackie play a big part in that?
He might, Ralph. It's 5 stories, and the main museum experience is the first, second, and third floors. You start on the third floor with the beginning of the slave trade and work your way down to modern times. And then they had special exhibits on 4 and 5 that included African Americans in modern culture, African Americans in sports. And we didn't even get to it. We got to the museum when it opened, and we left when it closed, and we never got to the 4th and 5th floors.
Wow. I've been there, it must have been about 25 years ago, and totally different than the way I remember it. As a matter of fact, I remember the Smithsonian as being quite small compared to, say, the Museum of Natural History in New York or whatever. That was my impression.
Well, the Museum of Natural History occupies one full city block on the mall. Right next door to it is the Museum of American History, which is what most of us think of as, quote, the Smithsonian, unquote. That's where, they trace the history of fins in the 1950s automobiles, and where you'll see a display of Archie Bunker's chair and things like that.
I remember that in there. And how about the space capsule that John Glenn went up on? Did you happen to see that?
The Air and Space Museum is now in 2 locations. They have the building that you and I have seen, and then out by Dulles Air Force Base, there is a hangar that is approximately 6 acres that contains a space shuttle and the Enola Gay and the Spruce Goose and other items like that of historical import. And I learned while I was there that, the 2 greatest test pilots of all time were Bob Hoover and Mr. Right Stuff himself, Chuck Yeager. Last year, Chuck Yeager came to AT&T Park, and I actually managed to buttonhole him in his wheelchair as he was coming out of the men's room in the press box. I was able to speak with him for a moment. He is my hero. Absolute. More than any other living or dead American, he's the guy that I've looked up to my entire life. And the number 2 guy was Bob Hoover, who was Bob Hoover was actually supposed to fly the X-1 the day that the record was set, the day that the sound barrier was broken. But he was not feeling well, and they decided to let Yeager fly it instead, despite the fact that Yeager had fallen off a horse the night before and broken 3 ribs. He had to actually take a sawed-off piece of broomstick with him to latch the canopy on the X-1 on the day that it flew and broke the sound barrier.
He couldn't reach
Bob Hoover was such a great pilot. I mean, I saw him in many, many air shows for many years. He was very famous for being able to do things like power off stalls with his P-51 Mustang. He was a terrific pilot. Just passed away a couple of years ago. When he decided to donate that P-51 Mustang to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, they allowed him to fly it to Dulles, land it at Dulles, and taxi under power into that hangar full of precious one-of-a-kind items. He's the only person in history who has been allowed to drive anything other than a tug tractor into that hangar. That's how much they trusted him as a pilot.
And respected him for his, the special compensation. No matter how they trust him, they had to be a little apprehensive. It was a respectful thing to do for the guy.
It absolutely was. And much to my shock, I asked our tour guide, how many people ask each day, as you're standing there, and they tell you all about Chuck Yeager, and they show you the X1 and the X15 and Scott Crossfield and all of that. I asked him, I said, it's displayed right next to the 2 booster rockets that we and the Soviet Union used in our space programs. How many times do people ask you, why wasn't Yeager an astronaut? And my guide who'd been in the Navy for 34 years and who had been working there at the museum for 10 years said, nobody's ever asked that. I don't even know why.
Wow.
To me, that's sort of the obvious question. Why wasn't the greatest test pilot in the world an astronaut? And there were 2 answers.
Great question.
Well, the primary answer was that he looked at their design for a space capsule and said, that's not flying. That's falling. I don't do that. Put some controls in there. Let me fly it. I'll fly it. But for what you want to do, a trained monkey will do just as well.
Wow.
And the other thing, and let me ask you this, Ralph, since you brought up John Glenn's capsule.
Oh, it was tiny. That's the only thing. Smaller than I could have ever imagined it being. It was like a Volkswagen bug, a little bigger, but not all that much.
And what does that tell you about John Glenn?
That he was. That's why Ted Williams looked up to him. He must have been just as incredibly great on some level, and some brass balls, all those things.
Well, here's what it tells you about John Glenn, which I did not know until I got there and stood next to John Glenn's flight suit. John Glenn was only 5'6.5".
Really?
All the astronauts, all of the Mercury 7 astronauts were short. And do you know why?
Probably to get into the equipment.
So they only had to design one size suit. Because
okay.
the suit design was essentially unique, and it was untested and unknown at the time, and they were concerned about if we have to make one suit 5'6" and another suit 6'1", what's the difference in the stretch of fabric between valves going to do, and how much do we have to, And you have to remember, we flew to the moon and back with onboard computers. It was necessary because there was there was just an unacceptably long delay in communication to a space capsule that far away. So they had to put the computers on board. And the computers that they used to calculate the flight of the Apollo astronauts were approximately 1/10 as powerful as an iPhone.
Whoa.
That's where you start to look at these things, and you have to remember what
puts it into
we
perspective,
had then.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, what we did with what we had compared to what we're doing now with what we've got now is pretty amazing. It's pretty astonishing how much we were able to do with, everyone I'm sure has seen the movie Hidden Figures. All of the computations for the Mercury flights were done by women with Burroughs comptometers and slide rules. I mean, it was just astonishing.
Hey, we're joined by a woman who doesn't have a slide rule, and her name is Nancy Finley.
Hi, everyone.
And
I'm sure Nancy has a slide rule.
In my
How about
head,
this?
Yes.
Slide, Jeremy, slide.
Right. We're on the Giant Show, and a little early, we're going to have, down the road in a few minutes, we're going to do an A show. But, Nancy, welcome to the Giant Show, and we're welcoming back from his trip Michael Duca, who went to Washington and the Library of Congress and got a picture with his book in the Library of Congress. And
nice.
Wow.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. It was a moment of unbridled vanity.
Oh,
all right.
That's okay.
Michael, this has been terrific. You're going to stick around for the A show. We're going to sign off and sign on again. So I just want to tell everybody that this is the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And speaking of books, if you like our offerings, any of them on the station, please box up some lightly used children's books and bring them to the Head Start program in the community where you're at. And those kids will develop a passion from reading. They will become school ready for reading, and they will be diverted from their devices and their games for a while. And it's a terrific thing to do because as a society we have to be sure that the next generation comes in prepared, because we're going downhill and we need rejuvenization, or whatever the word is. Like Shaw would say, we need a newer model. That's my George Bernard Shaw quote. So thanks for being here, Giant, San Francisco Giant Baseball, past, present, future. Michael Duca is the host, and we will be back next week.
Next week, Ralph,
we're going to stay on the line. I'm just going to push the button, and we're going to do the A show. Adios, everybody. See you next week.
And I'll be here, Ralph.